The studio buzzed with that particular kind of energy that only live television could create, half excitement, half nerves. The producers were thrilled. Having Carrie Underwood and Bryan White on the same set was a big deal. Two country stars, two generations of Nashville legends, reunited after years apart. The headlines had already written themselves. Carrie and Bryan, old friends, new conversations. Carrie arrived early, her golden hair perfectly styled, wearing a soft ivory dress that shimmered under the lights. She was calm, collected, and ready. She had done hundreds of interviews before, but something about this one made her uneasy, not because of the cameras, but because of him. Bryan White had been one of her earliest mentors, back when she was fresh out of American Idol, just a young Oklahoma girl with big dreams and a voice too powerful for small-town stages. Back then, he had taken her on tour, showed her the ropes, and treated her like a little sister. But fame changes everything. Somewhere along the line, that closeness had dissolved into silence. When Bryan walked in, the crew clapped politely. He looked good for his age, charming smile, that same country swagger, but there was a glint in his eyes Carrie didn't quite trust. He hugged her for the cameras, a little too tightly, whispering, "Feels like old times, huh?" She smiled back, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Sure does." The interview started light and easy. The host, Megan Hollis, asked about their shared tour memories, the long drives, the motel breakfasts, the fans who waited in the rain for autographs. Carrie laughed, telling a story about how Bryan once lost his guitar in a diner parking lot. The audience chuckled. For the first 15 minutes, it was all smiles and nostalgia. Then, the tone shifted. Bryan leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but sharp. "You know, Carrie," he began, "I still remember when you told me, Bryan, no matter how big I get, I'll never forget where I came from." He chuckled softly. "You think you kept that promise?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Carrie blinked, thrown off for a moment. The crowd tittered nervously. Megan looked between them, sensing the tension. "That's a bold question, Bryan," she said lightly. Carrie smiled tightly, her voice even. "I think staying true to who you are doesn't mean staying stuck in the same place. I've worked hard, and I've been blessed. I try to use what I've achieved to help others, that's what matters." Bryan nodded, but his smirk said otherwise. Sure, but some folks back home say you've kind of, how do I say this, distanced yourself. You used to come around, visit the old crew, drop by songwriter nights. Guess we're not on the map anymore, huh?" Gasps rippled through the audience. Carrie's composure faltered for the first time. She shifted in her seat, her tone now cooler. "I still visit home, Bryan. My family's there. I just don't broadcast everything I do. Not everything's meant for social media." Bryan laughed quietly, looking straight into the camera. "Oh, come on, Carrie. Everything's about image with you now, right? Gotta protect the brand." The room went still. The host tried to intervene. "Okay, let's move on," but Carrie raised a hand gently. "No, it's fine," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "If being professional and valuing privacy makes me less authentic to you, then so be it. I didn't realize success had an expiration date on friendship." A murmur spread through the crowd. Bryan leaned back, folding his arms. "You've changed, Carrie. I guess that's what happens when you get too big for Nashville." Something in her snapped, but quietly. Not in anger, but in realization. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man who once believed in her, but someone trying to pull her down to make himself feel taller. "You know what, Bryan?" she said softly, but with steel in her tone. "Change isn't a bad thing. It's called growth. Maybe you should try it sometime." The host's eyes widened. A few people in the audience clapped nervously, unsure if it was allowed. Bryan smirked, though the confidence in his face faltered for a split second. "Guess I hit a nerve." Carrie stood up, her chair sliding slightly back. She unclipped her microphone, her movements calm and deliberate. The silence was deafening except for the faint hum of the studio lights. "I came here to have a respectful conversation, not to defend my character on live TV. So, if that's what this is turning into, I'm done." "Carrie," Bryan began, but she was already walking toward the backstage door, heels clicking rhythmically against the glossy floor. "You don't get to rewrite my story just because you're no longer part of it," she said over her shoulder without looking back. The audience sat frozen. The cameras stayed on Bryan, who now looked pale and uncomfortable. The host muttered, "We'll be right back," and the show cut to an emergency commercial break. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Producers shouted into headsets, assistants ran toward Carrie, and Bryan sat slumped in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck, realizing too late that he had crossed a line. And as Carrie stepped outside into the cool evening air, she took a long breath. The night sky was calm, the city lights glittering like distant applause. She knew the headlines would explode, the clips would spread, but at that moment, she didn't care. She had walked away not from the show, but from the drama that no longer deserved her grace. The fallout began before the cameras even cooled down. By the time Carrie's car pulled away from the studio lot, the clip of her walking off had already been posted online by someone in the audience. Within hours, it was everywhere, on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, even Reddit threads dissecting every expression, every pause, every word between her and Bryan White. Hashtag Carrie vs. Bryan was trending globally by the next morning. Fans split into two camps. Some accused Carrie of being too sensitive, claiming she'd lost her country charm and humility. Others fiercely defended her, saying Bryan had crossed the line by ambushing her with personal attacks. What was supposed to be a lighthearted interview had turned into a full-blown cultural event. Backstage, immediately after the walk-off, the atmosphere had been thick with shock. Producers ran in circles trying to salvage the segment, while Bryan sat alone, scrolling through his phone as if waiting for validation. Carrie, meanwhile, had gone straight to her dressing room, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. Her publicist and manager exchanged worried glances, unsure whether to approach. Inside, Carrie sat before the mirror, still wearing the same calm, elegant demeanor she displayed on stage, though her heart was thudding in her chest. She could still hear Bryan's words echoing, "You've changed." It wasn't the first time someone from her past had said it, but hearing it on live television felt like a betrayal. Her manager, Dana, finally stepped in. "We can spin this," she said softly, setting down a bottle of water. "Maybe release a statement about how it was a misunderstanding. People will forget by next week." Carrie shook her head. "No, I'm not apologizing for walking away from disrespect. Not this time." Dana hesitated. "He's already talking to reporters. He's saying he didn't mean anything by it." Carrie looked up at her reflection, eyes cool and steady. "Then let him talk. I'll speak through what I do best, music." By that evening, Bryan White was already on a radio show giving his version of events. "Look, Carrie and I go way back," he said with a practiced chuckle. "I thought we could have an honest talk about fame, how it changes people. I wasn't trying to offend her. I guess I hit a nerve." His tone was light, but underneath it was something smug, something that rubbed audiences the wrong way. Comments flooded the station's feed. He knew what he was doing. This was jealousy, plain and simple. Bryan White hasn't been relevant in years, this was his shot. Carrie stayed silent. For days, she refused interviews, refused statements. Instead, she threw herself into rehearsal for her next Nashville concert. When the night finally came, the energy in the arena was electric. Fans held up signs reading, "We stand with Carrie," and "Keep walking, Queen." Halfway through her set, Carrie paused. The crowd quieted, sensing something real was about to happen. She adjusted her mic and said softly, "Sometimes people from your past will test your peace. They'll try to remind you who you used to be, just to make themselves feel better about who they are. But you can't let that drag you down." There was a hush before thunderous applause filled the stadium. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and before long, hashtag Carrie Speaks was trending, overtaking the original controversy. The clip of her short speech went viral, this time showing her not as a diva or runaway guest, but as a woman with dignity, strength, and grace. Meanwhile, Bryan's reputation began to crack. A few insiders from the country scene started sharing stories about his ego issues and old grudges. Industry blogs speculated that his comments were a calculated attempt to provoke attention. He underestimated her, one article read. "Carrie doesn't need to shout to win, she just walks away." Within a week, Bryan canceled his upcoming media appearances, citing personal reasons. Rumor had it that a few TV producers had quietly pulled his invitations. His PR team tried to control the damage, but the narrative had already solidified. He looked bitter, she looked poised. 2 weeks later, Carrie sat down for an exclusive interview, not with a talk show host, but with a respected journalist from People magazine. The tone was warm, measured. When the inevitable question came, did she regret walking off, Carrie smiled. "Not at all," she said. When someone disrespects your boundaries in public, you don't owe them your composure. You owe yourself your peace. Sometimes walking away says everything that needs to be said. The interview became the most read article of the week. Fans praised her honesty, her strength. Even some who had doubted her at first admitted they'd misjudged the situation. In the following months, Carrie's decision became a defining moment in her career. It wasn't about scandal, it was about integrity. When she later released a new single, Walk Away Strong, fans immediately connected it to the incident. The song became an anthem for self-respect, debuting at #1 on the country charts. Bryan White, meanwhile, faded back into the background, his name surfacing only in the context of that interview. And for Carrie, the walk-off that could have ended in controversy instead became a statement, one that reminded the world that true power doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to simply walk away.